In June 2025, a storm of protests erupted in Los Angeles, California, following a series of aggressive immigration and customs enforcement (IC) raids aimed at undocumented immigrants. These raids, which had torn through immigrant communities, triggered an outpouring of resistance. What started as small gatherings grew into a massive wave of demonstrations that paralyzed the city. From the crowded streets of downtown to the lush boulevards of Hollywood, people flooded the streets to demand justice, to protect their loved ones, and to speak out against what they saw as an assault on their rights. As tensions flared, so too did the confrontation between the state and the federal government. President Donald Trump, known for his unyielding stance on immigration and law and order, was facing a mounting crisis. The protests in California, particularly in Los Angeles, were unlike anything his administration had seen before. With the anger in the streets rising, Trump wasted no time in deploying federal troops to quell the unrest. What followed was not only a clash of physical force, but a battle of ideologies, with the streets of Los Angeles becoming the battleground for a fight over the very soul of America. The first wave of federal intervention came swiftly. On June 6, after the protests had turned violent, President Trump ordered the immediate deployment of National Guard troops and U.S. Marines to Los Angeles. Over 4,000 National Guard soldiers, along with 700 Marines, flooded the streets in an attempt to restore order. The president's decision was rooted in a belief that without federal intervention, Los Angeles would be completely obliterated by what he described as insurrectionists and foreign enemies. His rhetoric was as aggressive as his actions, calling those protesting against his immigration policies criminals, and accusing them of inciting violence. From the moment the first troop trucks rumbled through the streets of the city, the already volatile atmosphere grew even more tense. Protesters who had been gathered on the sidewalks suddenly found themselves surrounded by military vehicles and heavily armed guardsmen. In neighborhoods that had long been hubs of Latino and immigrant communities, people braced themselves for what felt like an occupying force. Families who had once felt at home in Los Angeles now felt threatened by the very presence that was meant to protect them. Among those who watched the military arrive with dread was California Governor Gavin Newsom. The governor had long been at odds with President Trump, especially on issues of immigration, but this was different. Newsom viewed the use of military force in Los Angeles as a dangerous overreach of federal power. From his office, he watched as soldiers set up barricades in places where protesters had peacefully gathered the day before. He immediately denounced the federal government's actions, labeling the move as politically motivated and a violation of California's sovereignty. "What is happening today is an assault on our state," Newsom said in a somber press conference. "The president is militarizing our streets, and that's not what America stands for. We are better than this." His voice trembled with a mix of anger and concern, knowing that he was now locked in a battle with the president that could escalate into something much worse. But the president would not back down. Trump's response was blunt and unforgiving. In an address from Fort Bragg, he justified his actions, stating that his deployment of military force was necessary to keep American cities from descending into chaos. "We're liberating Los Angeles," Trump proclaimed to a crowd of soldiers. "These protesters want to tear down the values that this country was built on. And we will stop them." His words echoed in the ears of millions of Americans, some rallying to his side, others recoiling in horror at the notion of U.S. troops sent to suppress their fellow citizens. The rhetoric grew more intense as the days wore on. In tweets and public speeches, Trump doubled down on his accusations. "These people are not protesters," he tweeted. "They are anarchists, paid by foreign enemies to destroy this country. I will not let them win." His words painted the demonstrators as a faceless enemy, a monolithic threat to the nation that had to be eradicated. Trump's comments incited both anger and fear, with many Americans now forced to choose sides, those who believed the use of military force was justified to protect the nation, and those who saw it as a gross violation of civil liberties. As the National Guard patrolled the streets of Los Angeles, they were met with protests in places like Venice Beach, Santa Monica, and the heart of downtown. The chants of the demonstrators filled the air, drowning out the hum of military vehicles, No justice, no peace, they cried, their voices echoing off the walls of buildings that had once stood as symbols of the city's tolerance and diversity. But these protests were not just about immigration, they were about the loss of democracy, about the erosion of freedoms that many had fought to preserve. For many of the demonstrators, this was a fight for survival. Immigrant families who had lived in Los Angeles for decades, often without legal status, found themselves caught in a battle that threatened everything they had built. Maria Hernandez, a mother of two from East LA, had been marching for hours with a sign in hand that read, "Defend our children, defend our rights." She was one of the many who found themselves fighting not only for their own future but for the future of their children. "This is our home," Maria said, tears welling up in her eyes. "We've been here for years, and now they want to take it all away." But Maria was not alone. Across Los Angeles, families like hers were joining forces, organizing marches, and raising their voices in defiance. On the front lines of this battle was Daniela Gonzalez, a civil rights lawyer who had spent years defending undocumented workers. When she saw the military vehicles rolling into her city, she knew the fight would be far more difficult than anything she had encountered in the courtroom. "This isn't just about immigration anymore," Daniela said, as she stood in front of a crowd of protesters. "This is about whether we live in a democracy or a dictatorship. This is about whether we have the right to speak out or whether our voices will be silenced by force." As the protests grew in intensity, so too did the clashes with law enforcement. In some areas, tear gas was deployed, and rubber bullets flew. In others, demonstrators and National Guard troops engaged in standoffs, either side willing to back down. Despite the mounting pressure, the protesters held firm, knowing that they were fighting for something much greater than just their own rights. They were fighting for the very principles that America was built on: freedom, equality, and justice. On June 12, in a move that would become a turning point in the unfolding saga, a U.S. district judge ruled that President Trump's use of military force in California was unlawful. The judge, Charles Breyer, sided with Governor Newsom and argued that the deployment violated the 10th Amendment, which grants states certain powers and rights that the federal government cannot infringe upon. It was a victory for Newsom, who saw it as a validation of California's resistance to federal overreach. But the victory was short-lived. The Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals quickly issued a stay on the ruling, allowing the military deployment to continue pending further legal proceedings. For Trump, the legal challenge was just another battle in a war he believed he was winning. In his next speech, he doubled down on his rhetoric, calling the protesters criminals, and vowing that no court decision would stand in the way of his mission to restore order. His words stirred a mix of defiance and dread across the nation, with his supporters rallying behind him and his critics condemning the escalating militarization of the streets. As the summer wore on, the protests did not subside. Los Angeles remained a hotbed of resistance, with families like Maria's and activists like Daniela leading the charge. The fight was no longer just about immigration, it was about the future of the nation itself. It was a fight to reclaim the soul of America from the grip of authoritarianism and to remind the world that democracy, once threatened, can always be revived by the people who believe in it.